Hello, I'm Derek Walker. I'm the pastor of the Oxford Bible Church. And now we're in the series called Creation, Evolution, Revolution. And we're talking about our origins. Are we evolved, amoeba, or are we created in the image of God? And last time I was sharing my personal journey of discovery into my origins. I started by adopting, with some reluctance, the general secular belief of evolution, naturalistic evolution, that we're all just a product of blind, random, natural processes that, first of all, brought about life in its simplest form and then caused it to evolve into ever higher forms. But then I talked about how I became a believer. And I was reading in Genesis, and it seemed to be quite a different story. That God created me as I was, that I didn't evolve from a lower form. But I struggled with this tension between, was the Bible true, or was what so-called science, as I was told, was the science of evolution? And these two disagreed. But then I was told by my fellow Christians in the church I was at, that I could still believe in evolution and believe in God. And this was called theistic evolution, whereby God originally created the world and he created the first life form. And then he used the process of evolution to develop it into higher forms. So this seemed to be a rather clever way whereby both evolution and creation were both true. But as I shared last time, as I studied the Bible further, I realized that this teaching was incompatible with evolution. The Bible taught creationism, that God didn't evolve higher forms from lower forms, but actually he directly created each major life form to reproduce according to its kind. And so, although God gave each type of animal and each type of plant a genetic potential for great variation, which allowed it to adapt to its surroundings, the kind of change that would happen through natural reproduction was always a horizontal change within the kind, not the vertical type of change required by evolution. So in other words, dogs and whatever can interbreed and create other types of dogs, but we don't see an increase of complexity. We just see different variations of the same kind. Whereas evolution requires there to be an ever-increasing higher form of life growing out of lower forms. And so that's the difference. Molecules to man evolution, or creation, whereby God made everything in its created kind, and then variation happens, but only within those boundaries. Well, here we had that tension. Creationism claims that God gave each kind of animal the ability to adapt to its environment through natural selection, but not the ability to change into higher, more complex forms of life. This is the issue. Creationism or evolution? Did life itself generate the higher forms of life and ultimately man? Or did God create man and the other forms of life in their present complexity? I was left with a challenge. Would I believe in creation or in evolution? Would I trust God, who ought to know, what happened as he was there, or what the scientific establishment said? And many of my Christian friends as well. This was a dilemma, because actually God's word and his world should agree. Both are revelations of God. He created them both, and they should point in the same direction. But while the Bible spoke of creation, science, or so I was told, revealed evolution. This made it difficult for a time to, was it creation, was it evolution? So I decided to take a closer look at the scientific evidence for myself. What kind of change is actually seen in living nature and in the fossil record? Is it the kind of change predicted by creationism, or the kind of change claimed by evolution? Does the actual evidence out there show molecules to man evolution, or does it just show variation within a kind? Do we see an evolutionary trail of creatures transforming ever upward into higher, more complex life forms? Or do we just see horizontal changes without increases of complexity, as creationism says and predicts? Imagine my surprise when I found that the so-called evidence for evolution was an illusion. Evolution was an illusion. The evidence wasn't there. All that was actually observable was the kind of change predicted by creation. Molecules to man evolution, where life forms increase in complexity by themselves, has never actually been observed in real life, even on a tiny scale. And this isn't surprising, actually, because that would contradict the laws of information theory. What that says is that systems by themselves can only lose information. They can only lose complexity. They can never gain it accidentally unless there's some external source adding in information. But systems by themselves tend to decompose, tend to corrupt, tend to lose information. Now, evolutionists, they know it's true that evolution has never actually been seen. There's never been an observable increase of complexity. They know that's true. But they claim, well, that's not fair, they say. This observational test, you can't expect us to observe evolution, because evolution takes millions of years, and we've only had 150 years to try and find evolution actually happening. Fine. But please don't pretend that evolution is some kind of observable scientific fact when it manifestly is not. If it's not observable, then please don't call it science, call it a story, which may or may not be true, but please don't pretend it's scientific fact. Please be honest and admit it's just an unproven story of our origins. You may choose to believe it, because you don't want to believe in the only alternative, which is creation. But please don't claim that it is established, observable science. What we actually see in nature and in the fossil record is a variety of kinds of highly developed life forms. Within each kind, like the dog kind, there are many varieties of dog, and they derive from a common ancestor. But there is no evidence of one kind changing into another kind, into a higher kind, as evolution has it. So evolution is actually a hypothetical story that postulates that the higher kinds develop from the lower forms, and so they're all connected as some part of a big evolutionary tree. Actually, on this tree, all we can actually see are the tips of the branches. The branches aren't there. We can't actually see evolution happening in the fossil record or in life. In other words, if evolution were true, and this is the big test of evolution, if evolution were true, if every form of life descended from lower forms, then we should be able to see that in the fossil record. There would be evidence of lower forms changing into higher forms. Actually, there is a total lack of these intermediate transitional forms. The evidence that should be there in the fossil record is in fact missing. Not only missing, but it's massively missing. Because over millions of years, there should be masses of these transitional forms as one type of life changes into another, and yet we don't see that. Each type of life is fully formed without immediate ancestors. This should have buried evolution a long time ago. The evidence is missing. We should have found thousands of transitional forms. And in fact, to be true, the game is now up on evolution, because our knowledge of the fossil record is now quite complete. 100 years ago they could say, well, there's still time, there's still many fossils we could find, and so there might be some hope of finding these things. But now our knowledge is so complete that the missing links are still missing in massive numbers. There is no hope of finding them now in any satisfactory way. All we can see now is a desperate attempt to find the odd fossil that could be, maybe, interpreted as a missing link. The odd few that have been presented, always with a great fanfare of publicity, have either turned out to be forgeries, or they could be just as easily interpreted as a simple variation within a pre-existing kind, not some kind of intermediate link. There are still no clear-cut, proven examples of evolutionary transitional forms, either now, taking place now, or in the fossil record. Evolution is not a fact. It is not observed. It is not science. Now, Charles Darwin himself knew the weakness of his theory. This is a quotation from his book. He says, "Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory." Darwin knew this was the problem, but he had some comfort because at that stage fossil hunting was a very young science. So he assumed, and he made it almost the test of his theory, that as they discovered more fossils, they would find these transitional forms. Well, we know 150 years later that evolution has failed that test because the missing links are still missing. And that should have been the end of the theory. Well, there are spiritual reasons why it's not the end of the theory, because the only alternative to evolution is creation, and many people just are not prepared to accept that fact. The late Dr. Colin Patterson, senior paleontologist in the British Natural History Museum, wrote a significant book on evolution. And somebody wrote asking a question, why were there no pictures of transitional forms in your book? And he answered him this way: "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggested that an artist should be used to visualize such a transformation, but where would he get his information from? I honestly could not provide it, and if I were to leave it to artistic license, well, would that not mislead the reader? Gould and the American Museum people," he says, "are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument." And that's an evolutionist. The National Geographic, November 2004, said 999 out of 1,000 frames of the picture of evolution are missing. And I actually doubt whether the 1 out of 1,000 is even there. Well, of course, this is well known, actually, and embarrassing to evolutionists. And there have been various attempts to get around this and hide it even. And the first has been the recent development of what's called neo-Darwinism, which acknowledges this truth. Stephen Jay Gould is one example. They acknowledge there's a total lack of transitional forms. So they get around it by postulating evolution didn't take place gradually, as genetics would imply, as Darwin thought, in small increments, but actually evolution happened in large jumps. Therefore it's been called the hopeful monster theory, which actually goes against really what we know of genetics. And so it says that evolution actually just jumps suddenly. Yes, there are gaps in the record, but evolution, the reason there are gaps is because there's nothing there, because evolution jumped over those gaps. There wasn't a gradual transition. So suddenly one life form turned into a totally different life form. And that's why there are no transitional forms in the record. Now, we're just told that this happened without any explanation of how it happened. In other words, we could put it like this. Having failed its major test, evolution reinvented itself to get round it. But in the process, it's made itself untestable. For it says that evolution happened, yes, but it happened in such a way that it left no traces. That's an untestable theory is not a scientific theory. Every scientific theory must be testable. And now evolution has put itself outside the range of science. It means that at best it's a hypothesis, but it's not science, as science is normally defined. In fact, the evidence against evolution is so great that any other scientific theory would be history by now. Well, as I began to discover these things, this made my choice quite easy, because I began to see that God's creation was revealed not only in the Word of God, but in the world of God. And on the other hand, microbes to man evolution was neither in the Word of God, neither was it observable in the world of God. I discovered actually that something like a magician's hand trick was being used. For instance, in our biology textbooks at school and so on, to create the illusion that evolution was happening by equating it with natural selection. You see, natural selection, on the one hand, is well known, and it's an obvious process of nature, whereby certain characteristics of animals become dominant in a population because they favor their survival. And in this way, their genetic pool enables them to adapt to their environment. So, for example, if you're in a hot country, then the genes for darker skin gradually get more successful because they are able to survive better in that environment. So the population takes on that skin color. That's natural selection. Nobody denies that. They adapt it. This is genetics that God's given us to help us adapt to our environment. The fittest survive and pass on their genes. But they talk as if natural selection is the same thing as evolution, whereas it's something completely different. Well, evolution is a hypothetical process whereby ever higher orders of animal are brought forth. But when you ask someone, what is the evidence for evolution? What's some examples of evolution? All that evolutionists will come up with is examples of natural selection. And they pretend, you see, that evolution and natural selection are the same thing. It's like a sleight of hand. And if you don't know what's going on, you'll be confused and you'll think, well, clearly it's a fact. And so you get examples like the pepper moths, where some moths are white and some are dark, and then the white ones are the main ones, and then in the Industrial Revolution the trees become darker, and so the darker ones are better camouflaged, and so you get more dark moths. That's natural selection. But it's not evolution. You don't see moths turning into something else. It's simply one type of moth survives better and multiplies better. That's natural selection. But that's not evolution. And so I began to realize that it's a case of the emperor's new clothes, this illusion that evolution was a fact. Do you remember that story about the emperor who cared too much about his clothes? He hired two swindlers. They promised him to make him the finest suit of clothes from the most beautiful cloth. They said, this cloth is so fine, it's invisible to anyone who is stupid and unfit for his position. The emperor, of course, couldn't see this non-existent cloth, but he pretended he could because he didn't want to look stupid. And likewise his ministers. And then the swindlers said the suit is finished, and they dressed him in mime, as if they were dressing him. And then the emperor went on a procession, naked, of course, through the capital, showing off his new clothes. And during the procession, while all the crowds are cheering, wonderful, wonderful clothes you've got, eventually a small child has the courage or the innocence to cry out, He's got nothing on. And the crowd know the child is telling the truth. But the emperor holds his head high and just carries on. I felt like that boy. You see, the emperor in this case is evolution. And his lack of clothes is the lack of evidence for evolution. And everyone who ought to know kept saying, look at the wonderful clothes. Evolution's a fact. In fact, it's proved. It's science. And the experts pretended they could see the clothes, but they couldn't, of course. But they wanted to keep their place in the establishment. And everyone else, the crowd, just followed what all the experts say. Oh yes, evolution's a fact, because the experts surely know what they're talking about. And so they didn't want to look stupid either. And so everyone repeats the mantra, evolution's a fact. And then, if someone says to you, evolution's a fact, you should just ask them, okay, tell me the scientific evidence for it, and get ready for an embarrassed silence. Or they'll brush you off saying, oh, well, everyone knows that. And actually, they're just part of this crowd, repeating the slogan, evolution's a fact. But eventually, like this boy, I took a hard look at the emperor and the clothes, and we'll do that in this series. And I came to the obvious conclusion, the emperor has no clothes on. And it then takes courage to declare that truth, because it goes against the whole establishment, against the crowds. We've got to understand and not be intimidated when the world says evolution is proved by science. Is this true? Or is it just a mantra that's repeated to hide the lack of evidence? Evolution has never been observed. And actually, much of the circumstantial evidence in the fossil record contradicts it. So at best, it's a weak hypothesis. Now, some of you, as I said, when you hear that, you're thinking, well, surely they gave me examples at school, the Galapagos finches and the peppered moths, But these are just examples of natural selection. Certain finches on some islands grew longer beaks and different features, but they are finches. This is simply what creation would predict, that in different environments, different features would come forth. But never is it seen that one becomes a higher form. And so evolution has not been observed. So if you believe it, fine, it's your faith, but it's not science. Now, natural selection is entirely obvious. In fact, it's a tautology. That means it's like 1 + 1 = 2. Because what does it say? Those best fitted to survive better. Those best fitted to survive in their environment survive better, reproduce more, and their characteristics will then become dominant in the population. But from there to say that all life came forth through evolution, that's a completely different thing. What is highly questionable then is the claim of evolution, that natural selection acting on mutations, which are random copying mistakes, that can explain the gradual development of all life forms from the original basic life form, from amoeba to man. This contradicts information theory, because every time you copy something, you lose information, you don't gain it. The copy is not quite as good as the original. And mutations always, as far as we know, result in loss of information. Never found a mutation that's actually increased complexity. And so evolution through mutation and selection is just a story that has been accepted, a story for evolution. Why is it being accepted? Because nobody can think of a better explanation of how it could have happened. But it must have happened because the only alternative is that God created. We know that mutations are almost always destructive. And although there are one or two that have conferred an advantage, they haven't done it by increasing the complexity of something, only because they've actually taken something away that made it prone to attack. But there's no mutation that's actually hinted at an increasing the complexity of an organism. There is no evidence for evolution. If you believe it, it's because you believe it because you'd rather not believe in creation. But the alternative of creation makes sense. God gave each animal the complexity, a genetic richness with which it could reproduce and adapt to different environments. Well, what I want to share next time is the positive evidence for creation, and look at the evidence for evolution to show that in fact the evidences put forth for evolution really are not at all convincing at all. So we do not need to be intimidated. One thing I want to say about evolution as we close now is that it is a hypothesis that describes how the variety of life forms we see today came from a common origin. However, it does not and cannot explain how the first life form originated in the beginning. It is not a theory for the origin of life. And this is where we'll pick up next time. Evolutionists cannot explain where life began. And that is the greatest weakness of their belief system. Life is so complex, it couldn't have arisen by chance. That's established. God bless you. See you next week.